The lab is dark, except for one window. It is 2 in the morning in Menlo Park, New Jersey, and the man inside has not slept in 31 hours. The table in front of him is covered in thin strips of carbonized thread, bamboo fiber, and something that used to be a fishing line. Most of them are burned. Some of them crumbled before he could even test them. One lasted 18 minutes before it gave out, and that one he thought was close. His name is Thomas Alva Edison. He is 32 years old, and he is on a temp number. Well, he stopped counting somewhere around 5,000. Stay with me, because this story is not what you think it is. This is not a story about genius. This is not a story about luck. This is not even a story about light bulbs. This is the story of a man who was wrong, constantly, spectacularly, stubbornly wrong, and who somehow turned that wrongness into the world you live in right now. The city you and oppose, re-in. The device you and oppose, reholding. The way every modern company on Earth hires people and runs teams and chases deadlines. All of it traces back to one restless, partially deaf, formerly uneducated man who absolutely refused to stop. The word his closest colleagues used over and over in their letters and their diaries and their interviews decades later was dogged. It and oppose, that's an old word. It comes from the image of a dog that has locked its jaw onto something and cannot be made to let go. That was Edison. Not brilliant in the way textbooks describe brilliance. Not a solitary flash of lightning. Something slower. Something more stubborn. Something that kept going at 2 in the morning when every reasonable person had already gone home. Here is what most people miss about Thomas Edison. The light bulb was not his greatest invention. Not even close. There is something else he built, something hiding in plain sight, that changed the way human beings create things. Changed it permanently, and almost nobody gives him credit for it. We and oppose, LL get there. But first, you need to understand where he came from. Because the man in that Menlo Park lab at 2 in the morning, surrounded by thousands of failures, running on coffee and stubbornness, that man should never have been there at all. He refused. He refused to stop. He refused to call a failure anything other than data. Something slower. Something more stubborn. Something that kept going. We and oppose, LL get there. But first, you need to understand where this all began. Part 2. Act 1. Origins plus early failures, 35 images, 328 to 1043 Memo, Milan, Ohio to New York, Edison and oppose. As formation, first failures, first fortune. Milan, Ohio, 1847. The town is small enough that everybody knows everybody, and everybody knows that Nancy Edison and oppose. As youngest boy is trouble. Not mean trouble. Not dangerous trouble. Just restless trouble. The kind that asks too many questions in a row and doesn't and oppose. Wait for the answer before asking another one. His teachers call him addled. One of them, in front of the entire class, taps his temple and says the boy and oppose. Brain simply doesn't and oppose. Work right. Thomas Edison is 7 years old. Nancy pulls him out of school that same week. She had been a school teacher herself before she married Samuel Edison, and she is not going to let a room full of strangers decide what her son is capable of. She sets up a table in the corner of their house, and she teaches him herself. History, science, reading, arithmetic, and something else that no school would have given him. She teaches him that curiosity is not a flaw, that questions are not disruptions, that not knowing something is simply the first step toward finding out. If you have ever had one person in your life who believed in you before you gave them any real reason to, you already understand what Nancy Edison did for her son. But there is something else happening to young Thomas that nobody can quite explain. His hearing is going, slowly, then faster. By the time he is 12, he is almost completely deaf in his left ear. At 12, he is selling newspapers and candy on the Grand Trunk Railway, working the line between Port Huron and Detroit. He talks his way into using the baggage car as a small laboratory. He starts his own newspaper, the Grand Trunk Herald, writing, typesetting, and selling it himself. At age 12, on a moving train. Later in life, he would say, in that blunt way he had, that the deafness helped him concentrate, that the silence kept the noise of the world out and let him think. Maybe he believed that. Either way, he leaned into it. He always leaned into it. He sets up a printing press. The Grand Trunk Herald, written, typeset, and sold entirely by one boy, age 12, on a moving train. And then, one afternoon, at a station stop in Mount Clemens, Michigan, he pulls a 3-year-old boy off the tracks a second before a freight car rolls through. The boy in Oppos, S. father, a telegraph operator named J.U. McKenzie, is standing on the platform. He watches the whole thing. A second. 1 second. McKenzie spends the next several months teaching Thomas Edison everything he knows about the telegraph. Here in Oppos, that's what most people miss. The telegraph was not just a communication tool in 1860. It was the internet. It was the entire nervous system of a continent. Banks ran on it. Newspapers ran on it. Armies ran on it. And a young man who could operate one fluently could go anywhere, do anything, walk into any city in America, and find work within the hour. Edison becomes that young man. He wanders. Cincinnati, Memphis, Louisville, Boston. He works the night shift because the night shift pays less and nobody else wants it. And that means he has the days free to read and tinker and build things that dawn in Oppos. T-work yet. His first real invention, the one he applies for a patent on, the one he is genuinely proud of, is an automatic vote recorder for the United States Congress. It would let legislators press a button at their desk to register a vote. It is elegant. It is practical. It works perfectly. Congress hates it. A committee chairman looks Edison in the eye and tells him that slow voting is not a problem to be solved. It is a tool. Delay gives members time to negotiate, to flip votes, to apply pressure. The invention is useless to them, not because it doesn't in Oppos, T-work, because it works too well. Edison walks out of that meeting and makes himself a promise he keeps for the rest of his life. He will never again invent something that the world does not already want. He will find a need first. Then he will build the solution. That decision, made by a 22-year-old who just had his heart broken by a congressman, shapes everything that comes after. He ends up in New York. He is broke. He sleeps on the floor of a battery room in the financial district, surviving on apple pie and coffee. And then one morning, the gold prize telegraph machine at the firm of Law and Company seizes up and stops working entirely at the exact moment the trading floor is erupting into chaos. Nobody can fix it. The chief engineer is missing. Men are shouting. Money is evaporating by the second. Edison looks at the machine. He has never worked on this exact model before. He asks for 2 minutes, opens the casing, finds a broken contact spring, resets it, hands the machine back, running perfectly in under 3 minutes. The owner of the firm, a man named Samuel Laws, hires him on the spot. Starting salary, $300 a month. In 1869, but it gets stranger, because that same year, Edison sells his first major invention, an improved stock ticker, to Western Union. The executive, William Orton, asks him what he wants for it. Edison has rehearsed a number. He thinks $40,000 is probably too much. He thinks $5,000 is probably too low. He stands there doing the math in his head, and then he can into Oppos. Do it. He asks Orton to make him an offer instead. Orton offers $40,000. Edison accepts. He walks out of the building, finds a quiet corner, and sits down on the floor because his legs have stopped working properly from the shock. He is 23 years old. He has $40,000, and he has just figured out exactly what he's going to do with it. Part 3, Midpoint CTA, 7 images, 1009 to 1119 memo pattern recap, plus subscribe, hook, plus tease of Act 2. So Len Oppos, let's stop here for a second. Look at what has already happened. A boy who was told his brain didn't in Oppos. T-work, Wright taught himself in a kitchen. A teenager who couldn't in Oppos. T here properly learned to speak the language of the fastest communication network on Earth. A young man who built something perfect and watched it get rejected for being too perfect, rewrote his entire philosophy on the spot. Every failure so far was pointing somewhere. Every closed door pushed him toward a faster road. And he is still only 23 years old. If this story is doing something for you, if you're seeing Edison differently than you expected to, hit subscribe. Leave a comment below. Tell me which part of his early life surprised you the most. The people who built this channel into what it is are the ones who show up, stay curious, and keep asking questions. Just like he did. Because what comes next almost destroyed him. Part 4. Act 2. Menlo Park plus War of Currents, 34 images, 1117 to 1750 memo invention factory built. Light bulb achieved. Mary dies. War of Currents begins. $40,000 buys a lot of things. For most 23-year-olds in 1869, it would buy a house, a business, a comfortable life in a quiet town somewhere with a porch and a newspaper and nothing left to prove. Thomas Edison takes his $40,000 and builds something that had never existed before in the history of human civilization. He builds a factory for ideas. Menlo Park, New Jersey, 1876. 2 stories of wood and brick. A long wooden table where 8, then 12, then 20 men work shoulder to shoulder 6 days a week. Chasing problems, Edison writes on a chalkboard every morning. He calls it an invention factory. He tells a reporter from a New York Sun that he intends to produce a minor invention every 10 days and a major invention every 6 months. The reporter prints it. The public laughs. Edison doesn't and oppose. Notice. He is already back at the chalkboard. Here in Oppos, that's what most people miss about Menlo Park. It was not a lab. Not in the way you picture a lab. One brilliant person alone with their thoughts and their equipment. Menlo Park was a team. A deliberate, structured, relentlessly driven team. Edison hired men who knew things he didn't in Oppos. Mathematicians, glassblowers, machinists, chemists. He put them all in the same room. Fed them pie and coffee at midnight, played the organ badly when morale dropped, and drove them at a pace that was, by any reasonable standard, completely unreasonable. Charles Batchelor, his chief experimenter, would later write in his diary that working for Edison felt like being inside a machine that never fully stopped. You could step away, you could sleep, but the machine kept running. And when you came back, it expected you to run with it. This is the model. This is the thing nobody credits him for. But we in Oppos, LL come back to that. In 1878, Edison turns his factory toward the problem of electric light. Not because nobody has tried before. Arc lamps exist, carbon arc systems exist, the basic science is understood. He turns toward it because he sees the gap. The gap between what exists and what people actually need. Arc lamps are brutal, blazing, hissing, too bright for a room, too hot to be near. What people need is something softer, controllable, something you can put in your home. He tells the newspapers he will solve it in 6 weeks. It takes 14 months and somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 attempts. The number shifts depending on which account you read, before the carbonized cotton filament holds for 13 and a half hours on the night of October 21st, 1879. Edison doesn't and Oppos celebrate. He sits with it, watches it glow, and starts thinking about what comes next. What comes next is everything. Distribution systems, copper wiring grids, meters to measure consumption, switches, fuses, junction boxes. He doesn't and Oppos just invent the bulb. He invents the entire infrastructure that makes the bulb useful. By 1882, the Pearl Street Station in Lower Manhattan is powering 800 lamps across 1 square mile of the most important financial district in the world. And then, the year that changes everything, 1884. Mary Stillwell Edison, his wife of 13 years, the woman who had sat up waiting for him through 1,000 2 a.m. nights, dies of what the doctors call brain fever. She is 29 years old. Edison is at the lab when it happens. He comes home, sits beside her, and, according to his friend and biographer Frank Dyer, weeps in a way that frightened everyone in the room. Because Thomas Edison did not weep. It was not something anyone had ever seen. He buries her. He goes back to work. Who else was there? 2 years later, he marries Mina Miller, the daughter of an Ohio industrialist. Young, composed, patient in ways Mary perhaps could not afford to be. Mina learns Morse code so Edison can tap messages into her palm in crowded rooms. There is something in that detail that stops you. This half-deaf man tapping words into his wife and Apo's hand in the dark, choosing that over silence. But it gets stranger, because just as Edison and Apo's personal life is finding its footing again, the biggest professional war of his career is beginning. His name is George Westinghouse, and he has a better idea. Pay attention to this, because the War of Currents is one of the most misunderstood chapters in the history of technology. Edison and Apo's system, direct current, DC, works. It powers Manhattan. It is real and proven and running. But it has a fundamental limitation. It cannot travel far. A DC power station can serve a radius of roughly 1 mile before the current degrades too much to be useful. To power a city, a real city, not just a neighborhood, you would need a power station on every block. Westinghouse and Apo's system uses alternating current, AKINI. The mathematics have been worked out by a Serbian-born engineer named Nikola Tesla, who had, in one of the great ironies of this entire story, briefly worked for Edison before the two men fell out spectacularly over a dispute about pay. AC current can travel hundreds of miles without degrading. It is cheaper to distribute. It is more efficient at scale. On every practical metric that matters for building a national power grid, AC wins. Edison knows this. His own engineers tell him this, and he refuses, absolutely refuses, to accept it. He is not a villain in this moment. He is something more complicated than that. Part 5, Act 3 Climax plus Open Loop Resolution 36 images, 1747 to 2326 Memo. Edison loses the war, factory burns, open loop resolved. Menlo Park, IS the invention. Here is what Edison does next. He doesn't end Apo's argue with the science. He can end Apo's the science is clear. Instead, he argues with the public. He launches a campaign so aggressive, so relentless, and, in hindsight, so desperate that historians still debate whether he believed what he was saying or simply could not afford to be wrong. He calls AC current dangerous. He publishes pamphlets. He invites journalists to demonstrations where his assistants electrocute dogs and calves with Westinghouse and Apo's alternating current, showing the voltage burning through them. He lobbies the state of New York to adopt AC as the standard method for executing prisoners. Not because he supports capital punishment, but because he wants the public to associate alternating current with death. The electric chair is introduced in 1890. The newspapers, following Edison and Apo's preferred terminology, begin calling execution by electricity being, end quote, Westinghouse, end quote. He is not a villain. He is a man who built something real, who employed thousands of people, who had staked his reputation and his investors in Apo's money on a system he genuinely believed in, watching a better system arrive and not knowing how to step aside. He loses. By 1893, Westinghouse wins the contract to light the Chicago World and Apo's Fair. By 1895, AC Power is running from Niagara Falls to Buffalo, New York, 26 miles of transmission that DC could never have managed. Edison and Apo's direct current system is finished as a national standard. The company he founded, Edison General Electric, has already been reorganized, merged, and renamed without him. The new name is General Electric. His name is gone from the door. Now watch what happens next. Most men at this point stop. The loss is too public. The humiliation too complete. But Thomas Edison is 50 years old, and he still has the lab. He pivots, almost immediately, into new problems. The phonograph, the motion picture camera, the alkaline storage battery, which he works on for 9 straight years through 50,000 failed experiments before getting it right. 9 years, 50,000 attempts. And then, December 9th, 1914, West Orange, New Jersey. Edison is 67 years old when his entire manufacturing complex catches fire. Not a small fire, the kind of fire that turns buildings into frameworks of glowing orange steel. 10 buildings. Chemical stores exploding every few minutes like artillery. The sky above West Orange lit up so brightly that people watch from the rooftops of New York City, 20 miles away. Mina Edison finds her husband standing outside, watching. His face is calm. His hands are in his pockets. She is terrified of what he is feeling, of what this means, of what a man his age can absorb before something inside him simply gives out. He turns to her and he says, end quote, "Go get the children. They will never see anything like this again in their lives," end quote. The next morning, he is already drawing plans for the rebuild. Now, here is what I promised you at the beginning. The thing Edison built that nobody remembers. The invention hiding in plain sight. It is not the light bulb. It is not the phonograph. It is not the motion picture camera. It is Menlo Park itself. Before Thomas Edison, invention was a solitary act. One person, one idea, one breakthrough, usually by accident, usually after years of isolation. Edison looked at that model and decided it was inefficient. So he built a different one, a team, a structure, a physical space designed from the ground up to produce innovation on a schedule. He hired people with different skills. He created a system for testing and failing and iterating fast. He documented everything. He made failure a process instead of an ending. Every research and development department on Earth today runs on that model. Every tech company with a campus, a whiteboard, a stand-up meeting, and a team chasing a deadline. That structure was invented in a two-story wooden building in New Jersey in 1876. You work inside Edison and Oppo's invention every single day, and his name is nowhere on the door. Thomas Alva Edison held 1,093 patents when he died on October 18, 1931. He was 84 years old. The night he was buried, cities across America dimmed their lights for 1 minute in his honor. But here is the modern bridge. The reason this story is not just history. You have access to more information, more tools, more collaborative technology than Edison could have dreamed of in his two-story lab. And still, the thing that made him extraordinary was not the tools. It was the refusal to stop. The refusal to call a failure anything other than data. The refusal, at 67 years old, watching everything burn, to feel anything other than wonder at the size of the fire. That part has nothing to do with the era he lived in. That part is available to you right now. Edison at 84, still in the lab, still chasing the next problem. He never stopped believing that the next attempt was the one worth making. That part is available to you right now. Part 6. Takeaways plus outro, 12 images, 2354 to 2400 hours, 47 memo, 3 takeaways, comment bait, closing punch. Solen Oppos, bring this home. 3 things. 3 things that Thomas Edison and Oppos' life, not the myth, not the textbook version, the actual life, leaves you with. The first, failure volume is a strategy. Edison did not stumble into 10,000 attempts on a light bulb. He designed a system that made 10,000 attempts possible. He built a lab where failure was fast, cheap, documented, and immediate. Most people fail slowly, alone, and without writing anything down. Edison failed at industrial scale. That is not a personality quirk. That is a method, and it is available to anyone willing to build the infrastructure around it. The second, the system outlasts the product. Edison and Oppos, SDC current lost, gone, replaced, and forgotten within a decade. But the research laboratory, the team structure, the iterative process, the physical space built for invention that is still running. Build systems, not just things. The things will age. The system, if it is good enough, will keep producing long after you are gone. The third, and this is the one that stays with me, Edison didn't in Oppos light up the world. He taught the world how to keep working in the dark. Every attempt that failed was not wasted. It was the work. The work was always the attempts. So here's my question for you. Leave in the comments below. Which Edison failure do you think was actually his greatest lesson? The vote recorder, the war of currents, or the fire? The vote recorder, rejected for being too perfect. The war of currents, lost publicly, completely. The fire, watched it burn, then drew plans for the rebuild. Build systems, not just things. The things will age. The system, if it is good enough, will keep producing long after you are gone. I and Oppos. LLC you in the next one.